So going back to what we were talking about, that we noted how in Egypt the population was highly concentrated along a river valley. And that has a lot to do with the climate conditions in this part of the world. So one of the questions that we were looking at is this a dry world? And so for a large part it is, but it can be more complicated than simply calling it a large desert. So if you recall, we talked about C climates in Europe. We talked about D and also some E climates in Russia. And as we move farther south from Central Asia into the region that we're covering now, we're getting into what are called the B climates. So I want to highlight a little bit more about the B climates, because what defines B climates is these are dry climates. B climates include desert climates and grassland climates, or what we might call desert, which are arid, and steppe, which means grassland, like in Russia, which is semi-arid. These are a couple of climagraphs. We looked at those when we looked at the climates in Europe and Russia, and this is one for Death Valley, which is a desert climate. And if you recall, these bars are precipitation, but you can hardly notice them here because precipitation is very low in desert climates. I'm surprised desert climates are dry. And then the other part of it is what we call semi-arid climates, or sometimes called steppe climates. And these are also included with the dry climates, but they're not quite as dry. They are grassy rather than being desert. This is actually a climograph for Fresno. So Fresno actually has a B climate as well. It's considered a steppe region. All right, I want to step back and talk a little bit more about climates. We've talked about what are the three main factors that control climates for a region. And if you recall, they were latitude, position within a landmass, and elevation. And I want to focus on two parts here. I want to focus on latitude and then also elevation. So when it comes to latitude, there are different parts of the world that are drier than others at different latitudes, and it has a lot to do with things called pressure belts. Pressure belts have to do with the direction that the air is moving as the air circulates on the earth. Where the air is circulating downward, that causes dry conditions. So in sort of northern Mexico and along here, this is the Sahara Desert. These are the sort of the deserts of the world. You can see they're associated with these high pressure belts. Elevation can play a role as well. We've covered the Atacama Desert in South America, which was largely due to a rain shadow effect of the Andes Mountains. So if you recall, as the rain shadow effect that we talked about in North America, as winds come in from the Pacific, winds move upward over the Sierra Nevada, making the Sierra Nevada relatively wet. But then as they move downward over the other side of the Sierra Nevada, it creates a rain shadow that's relatively dry. But one thing I want you to be mindful of, there's two parts. You have the rain shadow, but then you have the other side of the mountain range, which is a bit wetter. Okay, so this is a map showing the distribution of deserts and grassland. The lighter shade here are the deserts of the world, and the darker shade here are grassland climates. And you can see there's a patch of desert here in the American Southwest in northern Mexico, but a much larger one here in North Africa, Southwest Asia. The Sahara is really the largest desert in the world. And nearby, included in this realm, are areas that are also grassland zones. Now, so elevation can play a role in climate. So I want to take a look at areas of high elevation in this realm, and I want to look at one main mountain range here. This is called the Atlas Mountains. The Atlas Mountains are at the northern edge of North Africa, up here kind of in the corner. When we get into Turkey and Iran, we also have two other large mountain ranges, the Taurus and Zagros mountain ranges. And then there's one that right along the top of Turkey called the Pontic Mountains, and that also is an area that has creates a rain shadow effect. So I want to just show some pictures here. This is a map showing the climate conditions in the Middle East. And along here, it's relatively wet because you have a reverse rain shadow. So in the Atlas Mountains, you have a wet side, and then you have a rain shadow side. So if you're looking at it from the Mediterranean, the front part of them are fairly wet, and the back part of them are going to be relatively dry. Here's an image with the Pontic Mountains in Turkey. So you have wetter conditions. This is up near Europe, fairly wet. But as you move further into Turkey, you're in a rain shadow. It's going to be a little bit like Fresno. This is called steppe or grasslands in the middle of Turkey. As we get farther south, this is the Sinai Peninsula. Near Egypt, we get into more desert or drier conditions. You can see in yellow here. In fact, in some places in Egypt, it is so dry that there's very little vegetation. You can actually have conditions that are called a sand sea. So when I teach physical geography, I often note that deserts usually have some type of vegetation, but here you can have areas that are even an exception to that, where it's really just sand dunes. So while this area is dry overall, that there are areas that are exceptions. You have, the edges of the Atlas Mountains. You have the northern edge of Turkey, which is actually quite wet. You have grassland zones, but for the large part, there is a whole lot of desert in this part of the world. In fact, more than anywhere else. Now, so just to recap, that this area is dominated by arid or dry climates. B climates, so we would call them. And this also relates to agriculture in the area because most land is not suitable for what we call dry land farming. That means that you can't really farm without irrigation. Irrigation is a very important necessity in much of this part of the world. Now you do have areas that are wetter or Mediterranean along the coast, but you do have large swaths that are too dry to farm. And that tends to limit where people live. So for example, in Egypt, the irrigation is possible along the Nile River, but not along other places. And so the population is really limited to the Nile River. In the northern edge of Africa, you have populations along this sort of anti-rain shadow of the Atlas Mountains, but not much beyond them. Right, so this is a closer view of that. You have some areas near the coast with larger populations. The population density evens out in Turkey and Iran because they have high mountains and they're a little bit farther north. But as you get into the Arabian Peninsula and especially the Sahara here, the population density really drops down.